The Peter Schiff Show.
We are back. This is Peter Schiff here at schiffradio.com. Joining the show now, James Livingston, who is a professor of history at Rutgers University, where he's taught since 1988. He's also the author of 4 books, the most recent one titled Against Thrift, Why Consumer Culture is Good for the Economy, the Environment, and Your Soul. Anyway, it sounds like the makings for a great debate. I'm looking forward to this interview. By the way, his earlier books are titled Origins of the Federal Reserve System, Money, Class, and Corporate Capitalism. Also, Pragmatism and the Political Economy of Cultural Revolution. And his first book, I'm reading in reverse order. The next one, Pragmatism, Feminism, and Democracy, Rethinking the Politics of American History. Professor, welcome to the show.
Hi, Peter. Nice to have you.
All right, well, let's get right into this. I mean, the title of your most recent book is intriguing me. You're saying that thrift is a bad thing, that we don't want any savings, that we just want consumers to go out there and spend as much as possible. Is that your thesis?
No. The thesis is that consumer spending drives the economy, and we have to face up to that fact. Now, the obverse of that is that, and this is the part that's going to upset you a lot, that private investment does not drive growth. Consumer spending does. And if I'm right about that, and that's the economics of the case, then we have no choice except to embrace consumer culture. And that means re-examining the virtues of thrift, at least.
Well, if all it takes is consumer spending to drive an economy, why is there any poverty in the world? I mean, there are plenty of consumers in Africa. Why isn't there a boom there? Why don't you have all kinds of economic growth? You got plenty of people that have nothing. I mean, if there were ever people that needed things, it's people in Africa. I mean, a lot of them barely have clothes. You would think there should be a boom, right? I mean, there's plenty of consumers. They got lots of trees. They can print all kinds of money. So why don't they just print up a bunch of money, dump it on all the tribes, and just let everything go?
Well, now, I mean, you really want me to take that question seriously, right? Okay, so here's what I'm going to do.
Well, you're saying that consumer spending drives the economy. So if consumer spending drives an economy, if that's all you need is consumers with money in their pockets, then why do we have any poverty? Why don't the poor people just grow the economy by spending?
You just answered the question for me. Money in their pockets. It seems to me that the key to increasing consumer spending, and that is ending the boom-bust cycle that we've endured since the mid-1980s, is to put more money in the hands of consumers. Now, I'm talking domestically for the time being, and then we can go.
Right, but why doesn't it? All right, well, let's go to something simple. Let's say a bunch of people were stranded on an island, and they had nothing. They were just stranded on an island, and then a helicopter came by and dumped a bunch of dollar bills on the island. Okay, so how is the existence of dollar bills going to change their situation?
It's a really good question, and I guess we'd have to go back to Robinson Crusoe. I don't think it would. Do you? I mean,
if Robinson Crusoe had $1 million in his pocket, how would that change his circumstances?
You got me. We'd have to go back.
Well, you just told me that if he had a lot of money in his pocket, how would he grow his economy just because he had money?
But see, it seems to me a specious question. If you want to talk about the reality of our times, then it seems to me we need to talk about the distribution of income between labor and capital, between investment and consumption. If you want to talk about
I'm just trying to break it down to a smaller example. But I mean, what you're saying is if American citizens...
You know better than anybody. It's not an example that works. It didn't work for Defoe, and it didn't work for anybody else. So I don't see what the point of retreating to an island is.
Well, because I think if we put it into a simple context, if you're saying that just giving people money grows an economy, I think that if it works in a big economy, it should work in a small economy. I don't really see the difference.
I think that's a fallacy of economic theory, that if it works big, it works small. I think you cannot compare Robinson Crusoe's island to the macro economy we're dealing with in the United States of America at this moment. I don't think you can do it. But
what is given your view, what do you think the U.S. government should do right now, and how would that help the U.S. economy?
I think, okay, well, long term, I think we need to change the tax code so that taxes on corporate profits are raised. I think we need to change the tax code so that taxes on personal incomes above, say, $500,000 are raised. That's revenue.
All right, so let me just stop you for a second before. Sure. So hold on. Sure. So corporate tax rates right now are 35%. That's the corporate rate. How much higher do you think we should raise it?
Well, I guess maybe we're talking about closing the loopholes that encourage the export of capital. I think we're talking about making corporations pay their fair share, as you know better than anybody.
All right, but you don't want to increase the marginal rate then from 35%? You think that's the right rate?
No, I think 35% might work as long as we can make corporations pay. As you know, most corporations pay almost nothing, and their
all right. Well, a lot of corporations pay nothing. Yeah. Okay. So you just want to close some of the loopholes.
Taxes in federal revenues. And the share of corporate taxes and federal revenues has been falling precipitously since the 1960s. Again, as you know better.
All right, so let me just follow up. So what about on the individual level? Where do you want to bring the rates on the people that make over 500,000?
Where do I want them to be? I think we could start by going back to the rates of the 1990s, but eventually we might want to consider the rates of the 1950s.
Okay, but ideally. What do you think the ideal rate? Remember, it's you can decide it. You're the president and Congress. So where should we put rates? What should the rate be?
Well, that's a really good question. It's a practical question that I haven't yet addressed. But let's say.
Well, but you think you're saying that we should raise rates on the upper income people. Just how high should they go?
Well, let's say that you're right to include yourself in the 1%. Okay. The 1% okay. I think the 1% should be taxed at a rate at least, let's say, 50%. That's just off the top of my head.
Okay. So that's the federal rate. So if somebody lives in New York City, you're saying they should be paying basically 60% in tax, right?
Yeah, that would be fine with me. Yeah.
All right. So let's say so that means for a corporation, if I live in New York and I'm going to buy stock in a business to help it grow, if that business earns $1 and pays 35% in tax, there's 65 cents left. And then I pay 60% on a personal level when I get my dividend. So that means I only get 26 cents. So basically you're saying every dollar that a corporation earns, only 24 cents of it should go to the shareholder and the rest of it should go to government?
That's not a bad idea for the following reason. What do corporate profits do? Wait. Why don't you answer my question now? What do corporate profits do? What are they for? Do they actually?
Well, obviously, they do two things. They do two things. They reward the shareholders for taking the risk of funding the company in the first place and putting their capital at risk. So they reward the shareholders for making the investment. And then number two, they provide the capital for the businesses to grow, to make the investments in plant and equipment that can increase future productivity and hiring more workers and growing the economy. So if you're going to say that 75% of all corporate profits should go to the government, that's going to destroy the economy.
Peter, I know you haven't read the book yet, but the central argument of part one of the book is that is the fundamental fallacy of economic theory and economic practice of our time and of the 20th century. What you're saying is that private investment drives growth by providing capital and creating jobs. My argument, and I can demonstrate it with way too many facts and figures, is that you're wrong. They don't. These profits.
Well, what drives growth? What drives growth?
Well, turn it around. Investment follows the curve of consumer demand, not the other way around.
No, but consumers can't demand anything that hasn't been produced. How can consumers buy something that doesn't exist?
Now what you're doing is reinstating Say's law, just like George Gilder did way back in the day. And it seems to me that's another fallacy of supply-side economics.
Well, so you're saying that supply doesn't create demand. That demand, the mere function of people wanting something magically brings it into existence?
Did I say magically? No, you said magically. But you're absolutely right.
Then how does it?
How does it own demand? I'm saying that Say's law has been invalidated for about 100 years.
All right. How does demand create supply? Then you tell me how people wanting things creates things.
Well, let's see. If you're an investor, and let's say you're dealing at the retail level, you're looking for curves, trends in consumer demand. Now, doesn't that make sense? So you're investing where you think people might be demanding goods.
But where is the stuff coming from that the consumers are buying? How does it? If you're talking about a retailer, if you're talking about a retailer,
of course it has to be produced, and of course, in that sense, investment might have to be made. We'll go back to that question.
But what do you mean might? How else are you going to produce something unless you have the tools, unless you have the equipment to make it?
Good question. Very good question. But your question has to boil down to what investment is. You simply assume that investment is take some profits, you build some plant and equipment, and jobs are created, and therefore there's consumer demand. You're wrong. That's not how it works. It doesn't work.
How does it work?
Anymore.
How does it work?
Since 1919, maybe since 1910, it's just obscure here. But after 1919, it's pretty clear that net investment out of profits to increase the stock of capital becomes.
I have to cut you off. We got a commercial, so gather your thought.
Sure.
I want to hear this explanation when we get back. Sure. Anyway, you're listening to the Peter Schiff Show here at SchiffRadio.com. We'll be right back.
The Peter Schiff Show.
Anyway, before the break, Jamie, you were going to explain to me how it is that goods come into existence without investment. Is that the idea?
No, not without investment, but the trend of the 20th century since 1910, and certainly measurable since 1919, and Simon Kuznets was the pioneer here. He's the guy who invented the national income product accounts. What everybody, well, not everybody, but what many, many economists noticed beginning in the 1930s, but then in the 1950s, was that net private investment was atrophying. That is to say, it was declining rapidly. Gross investment stayed pretty much the same, but net private investment was declining.
Well, you're talking about in America, right? You're not talking about the entire world, just the United States?
I'm not talking about the entire world just yet. But yeah, yeah. Okay. So.
Yeah, I agree. Investment went down a lot in America. That's why we had to import all these things from the rest of the world. That's why we have these huge trade deficits.
That's one way to look at it. I prefer to look at it this way: that the replacement and maintenance of the existing capital stock is all we need to do to increase productivity and output. So, and in that sense, you're not creating jobs by replacing and maintaining the capital stock. You're just increasing productivity and output, but not creating jobs.
But if we were increasing productivity and output, we wouldn't have the trade deficits. The fact that we have the trade deficit shows that we're not increasing that productivity and output. We're simply importing the things that we're no longer producing because we're not investing enough, and we're running up these huge deficits.
I think that's simply wrong. I think productivity, in fact, has measurably increased, and Alan Greenspan was the person who most noticed it. Beginning in the late 1980s.
Then why do we have all these trade deficits? Why don't we have surpluses? If we're so much more productive, why aren't we exporting all the stuff we're producing?
Why aren't we exporting? I don't know. But if you're talking about tangible manufactured goods, that's one thing. But what about the export of our services? What about what about that? It's part of these.
But we have a trade deficit. But the services are included in the deficit. So even we have a net deficit in goods and services.
Let me turn this around. Why is it important to worry about a trade deficit? What's wrong with a trade deficit?
Well, don't you think going into debt is a problem? If we have to pay back, we're flooding the world with our IOUs that we have to pay interest on, and eventually we have to repay the principal. We have a huge debt. We're the world's biggest debtor nation. You don't see any problem in accumulating massive amounts of debt?
Not so far, no. I don't, actually. And I don't think there's anything wrong with the trade deficit either. Because
what about the budget deficits? Is there anything wrong with the budget deficits?
For the time being, I don't think so.
So you don't think a $15 trillion debt doesn't bother you?
No, not right now. It doesn't, because I don't.
Well, would it ever bother you? Would a $20 trillion national debt bother you?
Well, gee, I don't know. I guess it would depend on the ratio between the revenues available and the deficit, right? And it would also
Well, the revenue right now, the government is spending $1.40 for every dollar it collects. I mean, isn't that a huge gap? Doesn't that bother you?
Isn't the question you should be asking, how do we renew growth so that these government deficits might shrink? I mean, isn't that the key?
Well, how do we? Well, we've never seen government deficits shrink ever since we started running them up. But what do you think is going to shrink the deficit?
How in the world, Peter, for God's sake, how in the world can you say that if we ran surpluses in the 1990s? Come on.
No, we didn't. Every year of the 1990s, the national debt went up. There wasn't a single year in the 1990s where we ended the year owing less than we started the year. So the deficits always go up. But what do you think the government could do right now to create growth and bring down the debt?
I think the way to create growth is to raise taxes on corporate profits so that we might use that revenue to fund job growth for the time being.
But job growth from where? If you're raising taxes on corporations, I'm assuming we're going to have less jobs created by the corporations. So is the government going to take the tax money it gets from the corporations and use it to hire more government workers? Is that what you're talking about?
No, I guess you look at it this way.
Well, how do we create jobs by raising taxes on corporations? I don't see the connection there.
I think I'm going to answer the first question you asked me. Okay, you've been throwing this word investment around, and it seems to me that you're obscuring the simple fact that since the 1950s, so-called residential investment, that is to say, consumers' purchase of homes, of their houses, and government spending, had been factored into investment. So
I don't consider that investment.
Well, the national income and product accounts do. However,
government spending is not investment. Now, building, homes,
really?
Yes, the housing stock is important.
Why then do the NIPA people say, call it that? Then,
I don't care what they want to call it. Government spending is an investment. But I'm really curious, though. You're saying that we create jobs by raising taxes. But this is a question I'd love you to answer. How do we create jobs?
I want you to answer my question. Why do you get to define investment and not the national?
Well, why do they? But this is a more important question because I got to know the answer to this. How do we create jobs by raising taxes on corporations?
I think we create jobs by redistributing income to begin with, away.
Well, to who?
Profits, towards wages, away from capital towards labor.
But how do we do that? We raise taxes on corporations. What does the government do with the money?
I guess it builds infrastructure in partnership with private enterprise, as John Kerry's infrastructure bank proposed. I guess we could do that. That would be a form.
Okay, so what your idea then is for the government to raise taxes on the private sector and use the money to fund jobs creating in infrastructure spending. So the key to economic growth and job creation is to empower the federal government and take money out of the private sector.
That seems like a really good idea to me. But here, let me ask you this.
All right, so why didn't it work? Why didn't it work in the Soviet Union?
Let me ask you a question, Peter.
But why didn't it work in the Soviet Union? That's what they did.
What are you talking about? Who's talking about the Soviet Union?
Well, that's what you're talking about doing what they did. You're saying that we can create wealth and jobs by having the government spend the money.
Let me point something out. You're talking about the Soviet Union. I'm not talking about the Soviet Union.
Well, yes, you are. You just don't make the connection. You've got the same economic plan that the Soviets had.
That's so ridiculous. I don't even know how to respond. I mean,
well, what do you call it? It's not capitalism. What you're talking about? It's not free markets.
Actually, the whole book that I wrote. If you haven't seen any of it, I'm sure. The subtitle used to include the phrase "How to Save Capitalism." So, this is why it's.
But you don't save it by destroying it. That's the mistake Bush made. I want you save capitalism by practicing it, by letting it work, not by preventing it from working and substituting socialism. I don't want to save that kind of capitalism. I don't want to save socialism labeled as capitalism. I want the real thing. Anyway, James, look, I got to have you back on the show. We got to continue this discussion at some point in more depth. I really want to hear more of what you have to say in a longer period of time. But anyway, hey, thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it. Everybody else, we will be back. We got another full hour coming up of the Peter Schiff Show here on SchiffRadio.com. Don't go away. We will be right back.
And I pull the shade so I won't see them seeing me. having hard times.
The Peter Schiff Show.
Having hard times. There's no love to be.
Anyway, I want to backtrack and talk a little bit more about my last guest, James Livingston, and some of the things that he had to say. And remember, he is teaching our kids, right? Governments are guaranteeing a bunch of loans so that people can go to Rutgers and learn this nonsense. That should bother you a lot. But basically, what is his thesis? Professor Livingston's thesis is that consumer spending drives the economy, that it's not production or investment, it's just spending money. Now, first of all, I tried to ask him to explain how that works on a small scale, like a Robinson Crusoe. And of course, he admitted that it didn't matter, even if Robinson Crusoe had a fat wallet full of money, that money wouldn't have changed his circumstances. He says that it's wrong for me to try to break it down to a small scale because it doesn't work on a small scale. Well, the reason it doesn't work on a small scale is because it doesn't work. The thing is, if you break it down to a small scale, it's easy to see the fallacy. The reason they want to apply it to a big economy is because it's harder to see that it's a bunch of nonsense. You see, under my theory works on any scale. See, my theory is that consumption is a function of production. So if you take Robinson Crusoe, there he is on an island. He can't consume anything until he makes it, right? So if he produces something, if he builds something, then he can have it, right? If he wants a hut to live in, he needs to go and make the hut. He needs to build it. He needs to produce it. If he produces it, he can live in it. See, according to James Livingston, all he has to do is spend money and the hut's just going to come. Well, come from where? I mean, he could have millions of dollars. If he doesn't build the hut, I mean, maybe he could try to build a house out of the money. But, I mean, that's probably not going to work. But he's saying, no, I'm wrong to try to break it down to a simple scale. But somehow it doesn't work for one person on an island, but it works for 300 million on an island? Why? If he's right, if just spending money can create economic growth, why don't all these poor African countries just print a bunch of money, whatever their currency is, hand it to their citizens, and just sit back and let the magic happen, right? Everybody would have money. They can all line up ready to buy stuff. The problem is there's nothing to buy. You got to make it. And you're not going to make it by printing money. And the crazy thing is he actually believes that we can create jobs and economic growth by taking money away from the private sector and giving it to the government. And you can really see his true colors when I explain to him that if we have a 50% federal tax rate, which he said he thought would be a good rate, 50%, and that's just federal. So if you're living in a state like New York City, you're talking about 60%. It's actually more because you've got the Medicare tax, but I'll assume that he included that in his 50%. So 50% federal tax. So if you're living in New York City, you're paying 10%. So now you're at pretty close to 60%. And he wants the corporate tax at 35%. So I explained to him that if a corporation earns $1 and then pays 35% in tax, they're left with 65 cents. Then if they distribute the 65 cents to their shareholders and they pay 60% of that in income taxes, right? So they get to keep 40% of 65 cents. They get to keep 26 cents. So I said, are you okay with the government getting 74 cents out of every dollar in corporate profits and the owners getting to keep 26 cents? And he said, yeah. He said, that sounds like a great idea. What would happen? I mean, can you imagine the collapse? Would anybody want to have a corporation in America if the government took 74% of the profits? Why? Why would anybody invest here when they can invest in another country? Would people really want to do that? Would people really want? Now, according to this professor, he doesn't care. He doesn't care if nobody wants to invest their money because he doesn't think investment is where jobs and wealth comes from. He thinks it's fine because he says the government will do it. His solution to the current economy is to raise taxes on business and send all that money to Washington and then let them figure out ways to use it on things like Solyndra. Although it wasn't even Solyndra. He just wants the government to build roads and to build bridges and to hire people. Well, what is that going to do? I mean, he's basically saying that, well, it will create jobs, and then the people who the government hires to build the roads will take their paychecks and go buy stuff. Well, where's the stuff that they're going to buy going to come from? Well, obviously, it's going to have to come from China or other countries that are producing it. But are they going to keep sending to us if the dollar is collapsing? I mean, the whole idea to think that we can create real wealth, real demand, simply by printing money. See, he's trying to say that Shea's law of supply creating demand isn't right, that supply doesn't create demand, which, of course, is nonsense, because without supply, demand is meaningless. All it is desire. You can't actually buy anything that doesn't exist. And, of course, a lot of things, people don't even know about it. Did anybody want an iPhone until Apple made it up? No, because it didn't even exist. How do you want something that's not there? Although I suppose, I mean, I guess I'd like a transporter device like they had in Star Trek. But just because I want it, I mean, I can want it all I want. It's not going to change. It is not here. But if something is produced, all of a sudden, now people can buy it. But to believe, and I said it was magic, and he said, well, I didn't say this stuff comes in by magic. I said, well, then how does it come? If you're saying that we create things simply by consumers spending money, to me that sounds like magic. Where else is it coming from? And then he says, well, then we have the factory to produce it. Okay, well, where do we get the factory? Where did it come from? Where did the machines come from? Where did the tools come from? Somebody had to make them. And where did the money come from to make it? Somebody had to save it. There had to be some investment. And see, that's why people in Africa are so poor, because there's no investment. There's no production. Why is there no investment, no production? Because there's too much government. There's too much regulation. There's too much taxes. There's not enough private property. I mean, it's not an accident that the countries that had the biggest increase in consumption and living standards were countries where you had the least amount of government, low taxes, low regulations, sound money, because that's where you had the savings and investment. And it's the savings and the investment, it's the underconsumption that created all the wealth and the prosperity. Professor Livingston's got the cart before the horse. Anyway, we'll be back. I'll be taking your calls. You're listening to the Peter Schiff Show here at schiffradio.com, the gold standard in talk radio.
The Peter Schiff Show.
For you.